Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. Okay. Today is all about anxiety. Anxiety is the fear of things yet to come. Okay. And in the brain, maladaptive anxiety, right? This is kind of the negative form of anxiety. And we'll talk about the difference of why there's kind of a positive, good, healthy form of it. And then also why there's this negative, maladaptive, pathological anxiety, as well as the extreme form being anxiety disorders. But we talk about the sort of negative form that everybody doesn't want, right? It is basically the combination of expecting the worst and then getting too worked up about it. And that might sound like overly simplistic, but I'm going to argue that that is a good way to think about it. And this maladaptive anxiety, this bad anxiety, leads us to hide from challenges and even from life in general. And so this kind of leads us down a downward spiral into dark places in our minds, our bad expectations for the future. And before we get too far into that, I want to back up just a moment and talk about the definitions of anxiety that we are using here. So just give me one quick moment. I just have to check some settings, make sure. Okay, cool. Looks like we are good. Okay, so let's back up a few steps. Let's talk about what anxiety is. And at this point, we're going to be talking about that adaptive form of anxiety. And it'll become clear what the difference is between that and kind of the maladaptive form. So the real definition of anxiety from kind of scientific literature is that it's a state experienced in response to bad things, danger, threats that may or may not occur at some point in the future. It's got this future orientation to it. It includes a change in our physiology, right? A stress response engaged by our sympathetic nervous system, as well as changes to attention and cognition. And all of this together is designed to facilitate our brain's ability to detect threats in our environment and prepare us to deal with those threats, whatever that may mean for the circumstances, for the context. And that's why anxiety is not the same as fear. Fear is experienced in response to specific people, places, or things that exist in the here and now, or at least are perceived to be here and now. And anxiety, again, is more about the future. Fear is more about the present. Now, of course, anxiety and fear have this really intimate relationship where fear is kind of part of anxiety, but they're separate based on this future or present orientation. But anyway, that's kind of the distinction between fear and anxiety. And getting back to anxiety, we usually think of it as a bad thing, right? After all, why would anyone ever want to be anxious, right? Would you ever, volunteer, I want to be anxious for the rest of my life? No, because anxiety is unpleasant, but that doesn't mean that it's always a bad thing. There's a reason for it. There's a good reason to experience anxiety if you have good reason to believe that something bad is going to happen, right? Then it can be your ally. So an example that we'll kind of talk about throughout this video is the idea of if you're walking through, say, like a forest, you're far from civilization, you're all by yourself, and you see fresh bear scat. You see like evidence that a bear was just here. Maybe it's, claw marks on the tree and maybe a paw print. Very fresh. The bear was maybe just a minute ago was here. It's rational. It makes sense for your brain to become hyper vigilant, right? To scan for anything that resembles a bear. And of course, you'll probably make mistakes. You'll probably make false predictions, like seeing, the rustling of leaves and falsely thinking that's a bear, that's a predator stalking you. But that sort of false prediction, that kind of error in cognition, given the context, it makes sense. It's better, more adaptive to think there's danger when there isn't, rather than the other way around. But on the other hand, right, if you're walking through say like, safe city park and maybe like a small town where there's just no crime and it's in broad daylight and you feel the same level of anxiety for no reason or for no good reason, that's when it becomes maladaptive. So if your anxiety usually hinders you from living a good life, right, it keeps you from sleeping, keeps you from engaging with other people, from doing your work, from doing things that bring you joy, that is maybe an indication of at least maladaptive anxiety, if not anxiety disorder. And here I want to place a caveat that I am not a clinician, not a psychiatrist, not a therapist, not a doctor. So I'm not giving any medical advice or trying to diagnose anybody, but just sort of giving you the broad definitions of what these diagnoses might be. And there's no sharp cutoff, but instead a spectrum from helpful anxiety to deeply harmful patterns of anxiety. That's there's a spectrum there. And throughout this video, the first part of this video will really be about that adaptive form, that good form of anxiety that is helpful, it's good. And then the second part will get into that more maladaptive, pathological anxiety disorders on that side. So as we'll see, both of these share something in common at the level of brain activity. And that's really what a lot of this video is going to be about. This next section, we're going to be talking all about where anxiety comes from and how it arises in the brain. And of course, if you have dove into this subject in any way, you've probably come across the amygdala, right? I've said it on this channel before. The amygdala is involved in anxiety. You may have, even heard that it's the fear center, right, or the anxiety center, and that's not really true. The amygdala it's not the seat of anxiety or fear. It has a much more nuanced function, but it plays a central role in anxiety. And just to give you an idea where the amygdala is, I heard this from the neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux, who is probably foremost expert on the amygdala and its role in anxiety. And he gave this little nice way of finding the amygdala inside your head. If you were to draw a line going in from your eyeball directly back and then one into your ear, where those two lines intersect is the approximate location of the amygdala. It's in the medial temporal lobe. It's a subcortical structure. And it plays a central role in the neurobiology of anxiety. But it's not the only brain region, right? It's not just like, the amygdala produces anxiety. And in fact, a huge meta-analysis from a couple of years ago indicated that there were really two brain regions that were actually in this meta-analysis. These two brain regions that I'm about to mention were the only ones that were consistently associated with anxiety disorders. And so this is talking about pathological anxiety. And these are the insular cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. And so it's kind of interesting that the amygdala didn't pop up here, but it definitely makes sense that the insula and the ACC are important for this, because these regions are fundamentally important for our experience of emotion. Interoception is the perception of bodily feelings, bodily states, and the insula is probably the main player in that process of interoception, of allowing us to perceive our bodily sensations and kind of the feeling component of emotions. Excuse me. Okay. The ACC is kind of also involved in those processes, but it's very importantly involved in kind of risk, reward decisions, decision making generally, and so in expressions of emotion. It's I have a whole video on the ACC, very interesting region. But these two regions, it does make sense that they're centrally involved in anxiety. And we're going to talk about how they're involved. We're going to talk about how the amygdala is involved and how a whole network of regions involving the prefrontal cortex, the thalamus, and brainstem, how they're all playing a role in producing a state of anxiety. So let's see how these neurological pieces fit together. And here I have to give credit where credit is due. This is a lot of what I'm going to talk about here comes from a paper by Margot Kenwood and collaborators from 2022. It was published in the journal Neuropsychopharmacology, which is a really great journal, prestigious journal. And there's some other sources that I've linked to in the description of this video. And but this one really it provides the framework that I'm going to be talking about here. And I'll just say, if you really want to dive deep into this, if you really, really want to understand the neuroscience of anxiety, and especially the prefrontal cortex's role in it, I would recommend checking out that paper. It's pretty technical, pretty dense, but it's well written. It's really nice, and it is, again, providing a lot of the information that I'll be talking about here. So again, Kenwood et al. From 2022 in Neuropsychopharmacology. Thank you. Okay. So let's go back to that forest. You're walking through that same forest I mentioned earlier. You see the evidence of the bear, some claw marks on the tree that look just fresh bear scat. It's like the abundant evidence that a bear was just here. So in your brain, your amygdala is receiving information it's receiving sensory information, and it sort of tags that as that's important. That evidence of the bear, that's indicating that a potential threat may be nearby. And this is kind of generally what the amygdala's role is. It detects that there's something of biological importance. That's kind of the phrase that's sometimes used. Something important for survival or reproduction. In this case, it is, this is a matter of life and death, or could be. There's threat may be nearby, right? So that's what the amygdala is doing. So then you look up and you start scanning the surrounding environment for any sign of a bear. And why does that happen? Why do you start scanning the environment? Inside your brain, your amygdala has sent a signal to your prefrontal cortex, and it's telling it that avoiding the bear should be a high priority, or detecting the bear. This bear is a high priority, this source of potential danger. And so the amygdala is influencing the PFC to instantiate a particular goal, namely scan the environment for bears, right? Be on the lookout. But the PFC can't do this by itself. The prefrontal cortex is all about executive function. It's all about cognitive control, influencing the rest of the brain to do particular types of cognition and take particular actions. So it's the way that it does this is it sends a signal to another brain region, which can get our perceptual systems to pay attention to that specific those specific features of the environment that may resemble a bear or some kind of predator danger. And this region is called the thalamus, specifically the thalamic reticular nucleus. And I'll also mention, so the PFC is getting a signal from the amygdala, and then it is influencing the thalamic reticular nucleus. But at the same time, the amygdala is also sending a signal to the thalamus. It may be doing that. And so what is this doing? Why is this important? Why is the thalamus important? Well, the thalamus is kind of a sensory relay station. So information from all the senses except for smell, but pretty much all the senses go through the thalamus before they reach the cortex to be kind of decoded in a fine-grained way, before we really have a conscious perception of the environment. The thalamus is kind of this way station, this relay station where all the sensory information goes through before it gets to the cortex. And so as you scan the environment, you're particularly sensitive to threats, right? To the bears in particular. And that means also that you're less sensitive to positive information, right? And so because the way this is happening is so you have this attentional bias toward threat, right? And that's a result of the thalamus acting as a filter for sensory information, really. And the PFC, that's because the PFC told the thalamus to tell the sensory systems to scan for potential threats. But the way it does that is the thalamus filters information coming from the sensory organs before it reaches the visual cortex. It's basically selecting that survival relevant, threat relevant information to have sort of selective access to the cortex. And so the thalamus is stopping irrelevant information from reaching the visual cortex by allowing only that threat-related information through. And it does that same thing for other sensory modalities, right? Like hearing. So then while scanning the forest, right? So now you're scanning the forest, you're hyper vigilant, right? You're looking around what danger could be nearby. While you're doing that, you would probably, if you think about a situation like that, you'd notice your heart rate increases, your stomach tightens, your body feels ready to take action in general, ready to just do something, whether that's scaring off the bear or running away from it. And just a quick survival tip for you, you should always try to scare off bears or mountain lions also. Don't try to run away from them because they will outrun you for sure. The best thing to do is get really big and loud. And anyway, so if that ever saves your life, come back and give this video a like. But so your body's ready to do that, whether fighting or fleeing, right? And that's because at the same time as your perceptual systems are focusing on that potentially dangerous stuff, your body is preparing to deal with that threat. Your body is releasing adrenaline and stress hormones. And the way this happens is through the brain, right? The amygdala, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the prefrontal cortex are all dynamically engaging the hypothalamus and brainstem. And the hypothalamus and brainstem trigger what you've heard of as the fight or flight response, really the stress response, right? And what happens here is the spinal cord basically releases acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter molecule, into the body, onto muscles and peripheral organs. And what this does is it triggers physiological changes, right? More physiological changes. So the main thing is adrenaline is released from your kidneys, from your adrenal medulla, and this also triggers the release of cortisol, stress hormone. And all of this is making for the fight or flight response, a prolonged fight or flight response. And what is the point of all this? What does adrenaline do? What does cortisol do? It makes muscles ready for action, and it simultaneously slows down processes like digestion and healing. So it's shunting energy from systems involved in rest and digest to those involved in bodily movements like fight or flight. So that's kind of why it's called the fight or flight response, but more accurately, stress response. Your heart rate increases, your vision actually narrows, your kind of visual attention narrows, and your muscles are poised to contract. You are ready to go. So far we've talked about kind of the hypervigilance and then the physiological changes. And so what about sort of the feeling component of anxiety, where you feel that maybe uneasiness or being on edge or wired or tense? That comes from these changes to your physiology, right? And so you experience these bodily changes, these physiological changes, as interoceptive feelings, right? Feelings of the interior of the body. This experience, right, this interoceptive experience is mediated by a brain region known as the anterior insular cortex, the insula, which we mentioned earlier. And it acts like kind of a map of changes happening in the internal milieu of the body. And the insula takes all this complex information coming from the body and then has to predict what all that information means, right? So it creates a kind of summary about what's happening inside you, a summary that you experience as feelings in your body. And in this case, everyday anxiety, when you're in that forest, worried about the bear, you might describe it as tense or on edge or wired, right? Or something like that. Your body and mind feel ready to do something, to go, to fight, flee, whatever it is. So then what should you do? All right, that's kind of the next question you'd ask yourself. Do you fight or flee? Or should you just wait it out? Should you just see if you come across any more evidence of a predator? So that kind of decision-making, kind of mentioned this earlier, but that kind of decision-making depends on your brain's calculation of the risk and reward of continuing your hike or heading back to the car, right? Risk and reward. What's the relative risk and reward here? One key brain region for those kinds of decision-making uh, that kind of decision making is the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. And I have a whole video on the ACC. You can check that out if you're interested. It is a really interesting brain region, but it seems to have these neurons that encode the brain's prediction of potential value or risk for these complex decisions. So the DACC, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, is especially important in anxiety because it seems to activate in response to uncertainty, right? And it triggers the brain to search for more information to resolve the uncertainty. And of course, in some ways, anxiety is just a state of uncertainty, right? Combined with a prediction that something bad is going to happen, something might go wrong. And in fact, as we'll see when we discuss maladaptive anxiety, in addition to the amygdala and the insula, the ACC may be a key biomarker for successful treatment of anxiety disorders, which is really cool. But regardless, so let's say you're scanning that environment, right? You're hyper vigilant, you've got that fight or flight mode going, and you spot what you think is a bear in the distance, right? It's traipsing through the forest. It might be something, and you just decide, okay, that's the last straw. I'm going back to the car. I don't want to get attacked by this bear. There's no one else out here. I don't have bear spray. I don't have, phone service. So you make your way back to your car. You feel your body calming down again, and you begin to notice, how lovely, how beautiful it is out here. Your vision kind of seems to widen, right? That knot in your stomach quickly unwinds. Your hands stop sweating. Your heart slows down. You're feeling a lot better, a lot calmer. And so that unwinding of the anxious state, the anxiety, probably begins with your prefrontal cortex. And so that's specifically the lateral, being kind of the left and right edges of the PFC. So I'll just, quickly show on this diagram, although if you're just listening to this, it's not essential, but it would be, right in here, somewhere in there. And then this other part of this prefrontal cortex that's relevant is the posterior orbital frontal cortex, the bottom part of the PFC. So that would be on this diagram, like in here, sort of where my finger is. Again, not totally necessary. It just, this front portion of your brain, this prefrontal cortex, again, remember it's involved in these executive functions. And there are these two different pathways that allow the PFC to turn down the activity of the other regions, these subcortical regions that we've been talking about, that are primarily responsible for these physiological and other changes involved in the anxious state. So let's then jump into what those are, what those pathways are. How do we turn down anxiety? How does this happen, right? How does it just sort of naturally happen when you're getting back into a safe situation? You stop feeling anxious. So the lateral PFC, this pathway, there's a pathway that goes basically indirectly from the lateral PFC to the brainstem and hypothalamus. And the brainstem and hypothalamus are really what trigger the fight or flight response. They're really what's involved in the physiological changes and the kind of defensive action responses that the body might take. So the lateral PFC has a pathway that goes through the anterior cingulate cortex, which is right here in this diagram. Not super important, but this strip just above this white area, above the corpus callosum. But anyway, what's happening here is activating the lateral PFC effectively reduces the activation of the brainstem and hypothalamus. So in other words, by engaging this region, the LPFC, the lateral PFC, we effectively turn down the volume on the body's stress response just by a little bit, right? It's turning that down. It's like, okay, things are good here. That the LPFC is really part of this sort of like kind of rational thinking part of the brain. And so it's able to turn down the activity of these subcortical regions. And then the second pathway I mentioned, the second way that we kind of turn down this anxious response, this anxiety, state of anxiety, is through the posterior orbital frontal cortex, or kind of the ventral PFC, the area where the brain sort of curls under, and that part where it curls under, sort of what I'm talking about. Again, not totally necessary to memorize all these regions and everything. The point here is that this area, this POFC, the posterior orbital frontal cortex, has a unique direct connection to the amygdala, to an area called the intercalated masses. And the intercalated masses are these clusters of these inhibitory neurons that release the neurotransmitter GABA, but not super important. What they do is that when they're activated, they function to reduce the activity of the rest of the amygdala. They're like sort of an emergency brake on the rest of the amygdala. So when you engage that posterior orbital frontal cortex, in this context, it sends signals to the intercalated masses of the amygdala, engaging the brakes and severely slowing the amygdala's activity. So it has a calming effect. It essentially reduces our level of vigilance. So we've turned down the stress response and sort of the hypervigilance. So those are two major pathways where the PFC is involved in kind of regulating anxiety. So you sit in your car, you're reflecting on your hike, on your day, on the experience you just had. You notice you no longer feel tense, you're not worried anymore, you feel calm now, right? All has gone according to plan. The anxiety circuitry has gone back to its quiescent state. You're going to go on with your day, right? That's sort of the adaptive form of anxiety. And now we're going to get into maladaptive anxiety and anxiety disorders. So I'm just going to take a quick sip of water here. Excuse me. Okay. So again, everything we've described so far about your trip to the forest, right? This could be categorized as an adaptive anxiety. It's totally rational for you to think that there would be danger around and to act accordingly. There were evidence-based logical reasons that made you think that something dangerous might have been lurking around the bend. And your anxiety really only lasted as long as those reasons persisted, right? So you stopped feeling anxious when you got back to the car because there's no longer any reason to think you were in danger. The risk dissipated, and so did your anxiety. That's how it should go. That's how it's supposed to go. But of course, as we all know, there are times when anxiety is not so well behaved. For some of us, myself included, anxiety can transform from an adaptive state of vigilance to a maladaptive, disordered state of constant fear, dread, discomfort. And that's basically the difference between anxiety and maladaptive anxiety, or at the extreme end, an anxiety disorder. Okay, so I'm not a clinician, but I'm going to quote the American Psychiatric Association and use some of their information about this, about anxiety. And so first off, they estimate that about 30% of adults will experience anxiety disorders at some point in their lives. So you probably know somebody, if it's not yourself, who could be diagnosed with such a disorder at some point, or it doesn't mean you'll have it your entire life. But again, I think it's important not to self-diagnose, or for me to like armchair diagnose, or for, to just being throwing around diagnoses from, non-experts. It usually takes a mental health professional to actually figure out who does and doesn't have a disorder. But that being said, I'll give the APA, the American Psychiatric Association's definition. And they say, quote, "In general, for a person to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, the fear or anxiety must be out of proportion to the situation or be age inappropriate and hinder their ability to function normally." Okay, so it's not just that it's out of proportion to the situation, but it also hinders your functioning in your daily life. Things like sleep, engaging with work, engaging with people, engaging in joy, activities that bring you joy, and just hindering your ability to function normally. And then they go on to explain that there are several types of anxiety disorders. So it's not just one thing. There's generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, specific phobia disorders, panic disorders, and even others, right? And so there's these subcategories within this that have different criteria that must be met for a clinician to determine that a patient has that particular disorder. And yet there are, of course, similarities among all of these. And that, of course, is the presence of disproportionately strong anxiety that hinders our ability to function normally. Again, that's what their definition of an anxiety disorder. Now, in the brain, scientists are still trying to distinguish between individual anxiety disorders, right? What difference generalized anxiety disorders from specific phobia, from social anxiety disorder. So that work is really ongoing, but there is some interesting findings. And one meta-analysis, it's actually the same one I mentioned earlier, that has about 2,000 people, 2,000 people with anxiety disorders, 2,000 controls, found that across all anxiety disorders, there was hyperactivation in the insula and anterior cingulate cortex, which actually just the cingulate cortex. I mentioned that earlier. And that, again, makes good sense because those regions are involved in feelings, interoception, emotion, decision-making, risk and reward calculations. And then we saw how those regions are involved in anxiety specifically. And of course, that makes sense. That's all well and good. But you might be wondering, again, why was the amygdala not one of these regions that showed hyperactivity across anxiety disorders? We just mentioned it, gazillion times that it's a central node in the anxiety networks we've talked about. But one reason for its absence, if I'm to speculate, could be that it's not merely hyperactivity of the amygdala, but rather dysregulated or otherwise dysfunctional activity within the amygdala's microcircuits, like within the actual nuclei of the amygdala, that contributes to anxiety. That's speculation. So it might not just be that hyperactivation is the key, but whatever the case is, other meta-analyses and studies have shown that the amygdala is part of the brain's anxiety circuitry in anxiety disorders. Okay, so let's get into what we can say about the differences between these specific disorders, because I kind of want you to understand that there are these key differences. And so we know that they all involve hyperactivity of the insula and cingulate cortex, but what differentiates them on the basis of kind of diagnoses? So generalized anxiety disorder is defined by the American Psychiatric Association as involving persistent and excessive worry that interferes with daily activities. This ongoing worry and tension may be accompanied by physical symptoms such as restlessness, feeling on edge or easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating, muscle tension, or problems sleeping. Often the worries focus on everyday things such as job responsibilities, family health, or minor matters such as chores, car repairs, or appointments. So persistent and excessive worry that interferes with daily activities. On the other hand, right, a different one of these anxiety disorders, specific phobia, you've probably heard of, phobias. And this is the, quote, excessive and persistent fear of a specific object, situation, or activity that is generally not harmful, right? So, and they write that patients know their fear is excessive, but they can't overcome it. These fears cause such distress that some people go to extreme lengths to avoid what they fear. Examples are public speaking, fear of flying, and fear of spiders. Okay, so yeah, you can see those are, fairly different diagnoses, fairly different disorders, or descriptions really of disorders. And so what about the brain? How do these two disorders differ neurologically? And this is kind of, again, this is really early on in this neuroscience, but that meta-analysis I mentioned showed that generalized anxiety disorder was associated with reduced activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, whereas specific phobia was associated with increased activity in that region. So that's interesting, but what does it actually tell us about how the brain produces the different pathologies associated with each of these disorders? So the authors of that meta-analysis were kind of agnostic on that question. They didn't, opine on that. They didn't say, "Oh, here's what we believe is going on." But we can maybe speculate a bit based on what we know about the function of the dorsal anterior cingulate. So again, the DACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, is involved in goal-directed actions. So it could be that in generalized anxiety disorders, it is sort of paralyzing us with regard to goal-directed action. So we're not going to take those goal-directed actions. We're just avoiding. Whereas phobias, specific phobia, initiates goal-directed actions, right? So that could be why there's this difference in the DACC's activation in these two specific anxiety disorders. And because phobias would engage goal-directed action because like getting away from that feared object. Again, this is speculation. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, because the reality is that the neuroscience for these specific disorders is very new. So let's broaden our focus and let's look at the similarities. Let's look at what is similar across all anxiety disorders rather than the differences across them. So let's talk more about maladaptive anxiety and anxiety disorders in general. So in our story of you in the forest with the bear, you felt anxious about the bear in the forest, and we noted that you had an increased attentional bias toward threat and danger, right? Your thalamic reticular nucleus, your thalamus, was filtering perceptual information and allowing mainly threat-related information to reach the cortex. So anything remotely resembling a bear was more noticeable, and in people with anxiety disorders, this pattern is there as well. The brain seems to permanently turn on this bias toward threat-related information, right? That's why it's maladaptive. It's turning on this bias toward threat-related information. That's one piece of it. Also, when you were traipsing through the forest, you had a negative bias, not only in your perception, but also in your interpretation of ambiguous information, right? We said you're more likely to interpret an innocent rustling of the leaves. You see rustling of the leaves and indicate that you were being stalked by a predator. Similarly, people with anxiety disorders tend to interpret ambiguous information more negatively than healthy controls. So for example, imagine you read, the following, you get an email from your boss, right? And it's kind of ambiguous. It says, "After our performance reviews, I have some noteworthy observations. Let's set up a one-on-one, details to follow." Could be good, could be bad, right? Doesn't really offer much in the way of assurance. Did the performance review go good or bad? Who knows, right? But all else being equal, someone with an anxiety disorder would be more likely to interpret that ambiguity as very bad, right? Or that looks really bad. And even worse, people with anxiety disorders tend to describe themselves with more negative traits than positive traits. So they would already be worried that things did not go well in the performance review. They'd be like, "Oh, of course I did terrible." And I'm generalizing here. Not every single person with an anxiety disorder is going to have every symptom I talk about or every brain pattern that I'm describing. I'm generalizing. But it's as if the anxiety disorders make the brain set the goal of interpreting everything in the worst possible light. So just as your brain set that goal of scanning the forest for danger and being hyper aware of anything that might pose a risk to your life, namely the bear, right? Perhaps something similar is going on all the time in anxiety disorders. So perhaps the prefrontal cortex is stuck with the goal of being hyper aware of anything that might pose a risk to one's well-being. So that's why the prefrontal cortex has this role in not only regulating and turning down anxiety, but also producing the anxious state. So now going back to the forest, right? You're back in the forest. Let's imagine that you were about to get in your car, or you're about to get in the car, but you look over your shoulder and you see a bear running right at you. Terrifying. Luckily, you had just enough time to get in your car, start the engine, and speed off before the bear could plunge his claws into you. That would be terrifying. That would be a pretty terrifying experience. And it would be rational, right, to worry about running into hostile bears in that same area of the forest. And you probably tell your friends, you probably avoid going to that area of the forest for some time, but say you muster the courage, right? The next time you decide to go there, you go there again, right? So the next time you went there, this time you're carrying bear mace, right? You're preparing a little more. You might still feel some anxiety, right? Understandably, right? But eventually you keep going back to this place again and again, many times. You never see a bear again in that location. You'd probably not be so worried anymore, right? You're like, that was a fluke, right? This can be this kind of process of going back again and again, and your anxiety reducing over time about what could happen with the bears. That could be considered a form of something called extinction learning. I've talked about extinction learning in a video about fear conditioning, fear learning essentially. But extinction learning is basically you didn't forget your experience with the bear, but instead you learned that the context doesn't usually predict a bear. It was just a fluke, right? If you have an anxiety disorder, it would be much harder to engage this form of learning. For example, it might take you many, many more safe experiences in that area of the forest before your brain could feel relaxed in that context, even if you knew that wasn't likely to happen again. And in the brain, extinction relies on the inhibitory circuit that goes from the posterior orbital frontal cortex, that ventral PFC where the brain kind of curls over there behind your eyes, really, to the amygdala, that inhibitory circuit, to the intercalated masses of the amygdala. And so individuals with anxiety disorders, their PFC doesn't activate nearly as much during extinction learning tasks, like laboratory tasks that involve the same kind of extinction learning. The PFC doesn't activate nearly as much. So there's kind of much less in the way of inhibiting the amygdala. So the amygdala is kind of kicking that anxiety circuitry into gear, even in situations that only kind of remotely resemble the original situation. So there's just less inhibitory activity from the PFC to the amygdala that prevents extinction learning or inhibits extinction learning, really. And so, in fact, this is related to another problem that's observed in anxiety disorders: overgeneralization. So people with anxiety disorders tend to engage a threat response to non-threatening stimuli. So if the stimuli are not only perceptually similar, but conceptually similar to a threatening object. And I'll explain what that means in just a second. And so I want to here quote that paper I mentioned that has been extremely helpful for my research and providing much of the information I'm talking about here, from Margot Kenwood, Ned Kalin, and Helen Barbas. These are the authors of that 2020 review. And they give an example of someone who has specific phobia of dogs. I'm going to quote them here. They write, quote, "An initial phobia of dogs could lead to anxiety in places where an encounter with a dog could occur, parks, sidewalks, etc. While these concepts share minimal sensory features with a dog, their conceptual linkage, paired with the aversive association, facilitates the generalization of the phobia." So it's not that you're seeing things that look like dogs, which is triggering that the anxiety, but that there is concepts linked to a dog, parks, sidewalks, that the context of where you are. And so they go on to speculate. They interpret this as this may be explained by aberrant activity in the VMPFC or the orbital frontal cortex, right? That's that region behind your eyes, where the brain curls over. So why would that be? Why would there be the strange or the aberrant activity in that region contribute to this overgeneralization? Because these regions, they explain, are important for encoding cognitive maps, right, which describe the conceptual relationships between objects. So we can become afraid of abstract things like being afraid of places where we might see dogs if we had a phobia of dogs, even though, you might not run into a dog at all. So as you can imagine, that persistent bias toward danger, the negativity bias in interpretation, right, of ambiguous information, the overgeneralization we just talked about, the difficulty in extinction learning, all of that is associated in anxiety disorders with increased activation of the sympathetic nervous system, right? That fight or flight response. It's kind of like, the gearbox of the brain is sort of stuck in fight or flight mode. Of course, that's not a literal a description, but a metaphorical one. Too much adrenaline, too much of the time. It's uncomfortable and maybe even painful, right? To be in that kind of state all the time. And then that unpleasantness leads many people with anxiety disorders to simply avoid situations that induce or worsen their state of anxiety. Avoidance, this is key. They don't want to feel those awful sensations. We can all relate with that. So what they do, what at first appears rational to them, what appears like what they should do, they avoid them altogether, right? Just avoid. But avoidance isn't as helpful as it first appears because, of course, when you avoid situations that make you anxious, you deny yourself the chance to learn that those situations aren't as threatening as they first appeared, and that they might even be beneficial or enjoyable. And worse yet, you note that your brain kind of subconsciously, unconsciously notes that avoidance seemed to make things better, right? There's sort of this maybe more primal part of the brain that's noticing like, okay, feel better after avoidance, right? And after all, because you're safe at home, you're alone watching Netflix rather than attending the Halloween party, right? Happy Halloween, by the way, everyone. Today's October 31st. But you're safe, right? You've avoided this situation. And so your brain will remember that. And even after, if you're going to the party would have been more fun, even if it would have been beneficial, excuse me, or at least not as bad as you thought, your brain doesn't really know that for certain. It has no evidence, and all you know is that you feel relieved, right? And what do you think will happen next time you get invited to a party or something else that triggers that anxiety? Well, since you've effectively trained your brain to think party equals anxiety or whatever the situation may be, and avoidance equals safety or relief, you will probably be less likely to say yes, right? Avoidance pushes you into this gradual downward spiral. We hide from those challenges. And thanks to that overgeneralization, we slowly begin to hide from more and more and from life in general. We begin this descent, this gradual descent into progressively smaller and darker corners of our mind because we're avoiding so much. But the question is, how do we climb out of that darkness? What strategies are available for people who experience this kind of maladaptive anxiety or these anxiety disorders? Let's look at that. So again, here I really want to emphasize I'm not a clinician, I'm not a therapist, not a psychiatrist, not a doctor. I am a science communicator, and this is from my reading of the literature, the scientific and some of the clinical literature. And I think none of this is really controversial. I just want to kind of present what are the available options if this is something you are dealing with or someone is dealing with. There are maybe strategies for managing anxiety. And so let's get into those. I'm going to take another quick sip of water. Okay. So anxiety at its core is a survival mechanism, right? But the delicate interaction between the PFC and the subcortical defensive anxiety-related circuitry may transform into maladaptive patterns, right? Particularly amidst kind of this exaggerated threat perception and skewed learning in those ambiguous circumstances. So what can we do? Well, to begin, there are pharmacological interventions, right? And again, I'm not recommending, I'm not giving anybody advice, mental health or medical advice here. But just to mention that there's that nuanced interplay between the circuits we talked about. This helps explain why certain drugs like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, and benzodiazepines can work, especially those SSRIs and benzodiazepines. So SSRIs essentially increase the concentration of available serotonin in synaptic space, and the benzodiazepines act at GABA receptors, and these are two different mechanisms. This serotonin is kind of like, I have some videos on serotonin. I have a whole series on serotonin, and I guess the sort of takeaway from all that, which is a lot of complex technical information, is that increasing serotonin essentially increases like stress coping responses, especially like passive responses like, okay, we don't need to do anything, everything's okay. Oversimplification, of course, but useful nonetheless. So you can see why that might be helpful. And indeed, this is one of the frontline medications for like severe anxiety disorders. So many people take SSRIs for anxiety disorders as well as major depression. But benzodiazepines, this is another drug that's used to treat these kinds of disorders. It essentially just enhances inhibitory neurotransmission in the brain. So it's just kind of like, I don't know, like a dimmer switch almost for neural activity in the brain. And you can see why that would help with some of this stuff we're talking about. I'm not going to go too deep into the pharmacological interventions. I think there's a lot there, but I'm going to move on to more behavioral, cognitive interventions that are available. So cognitive and behavioral therapy, right? They can kind of offer a scaffold, a framework to challenge and modify maladaptive cognitive constructs, unhelpful thoughts, cognitive distortions. And these therapies can kind of channel the power of exposure therapy, facing the kind of objects that induce the state of anxiety, and cognitive restructuring, sort of reframing, reappraisal of these situations to diffuse that anxiety associated with that exaggerated threat perception. So for instance, an individual plagued by, like fear of heights, a specific phobia, might gradually, under the guidance of a therapist, face that fear and eventually kind of be able to gradually, step onto higher and higher ledges and be able to savor the view from a skyscraper's observation deck. And there's a lot more to cognitive therapies and behavioral therapies. And in an upcoming video, I'm going to be going into a much more actionable angle of how to approach maladaptive anxieties, not necessarily anxiety disorders, but kind of the maladaptive anxiety that many of us experience. So I'm not going to go too deep into some of these other strategies here. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the interesting sort of future stuff that might be on the horizon, some of the kind of like neurotechnology that might help, especially with these severe anxiety disorders. So things like transcranial magnetic stimulation and deep brain stimulation, able to kind of directly change the activity of the brain. So we talked about all these neural circuits that are showing aberrant maladaptive patterns of activity in anxiety disorders. So if we could target and normalize that activation, that could be a promising frontier, right? So there's some studies going on with this, targeting that the amygdala, or the connection from the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala. I'm not going to go too deep into this, getting really close on the hour-long time I have here. And one thing I want to mention, I kind of mentioned this earlier, is that there's these interesting studies on what kind of biomarkers, what kind of brain activation patterns can we look at to see if somebody is, what correlates with somebody's symptoms of an anxiety disorder kind of going away, being ameliorated. And those are really come down to three brain regions we've talked about: the anterior cingulate cortex, the anterior insula, and the amygdala. And so scientists have found that when their symptoms of an anxiety disorder going away, thanks to maybe therapy and treatments, they show that the activity in those regions comes to resemble that of a healthy control much more. So that might be an interesting biomarker going forward, that perhaps in the future, the insula, the anterior cingulate, and the amygdala might be used as kind of a rough approximation of someone's their symptoms are starting to ameliorate, starting to go away. And again, I'm going to have a video coming up, a shorter video and kind of explainer video that dives into a story of anxiety, somebody experiencing anxiety disorder, and how they come out of that. And so I want that to be a much more actionable video. So definitely stay tuned for that. That'll be coming out in the coming weeks. Working on it right now. But covered a lot of ground in this video. I understand it's a lot of technical information. And again, I want to just emphasize that video that's coming up won't be quite as technical, diving into all this circuitry, but I really wanted to provide that foundation. I want to lay that neuroscientific foundation, so that when we do talk about the more, seeing it from a more actionable angle of how you can actually take control of these processes, I wanted that to be really clear, that this is kind of the science that I'm working off of to develop that story. But let's go back and let's just summarize everything we've talked about. This will be kind of serve as a conclusion here. So maladaptive anxiety, right, is that combination of expecting the worst and overreacting to it, getting too worked up about it. It can lead to a tendency to avoid challenges and even to kind of life itself, to even just minor everyday things. Can initiate that downward spiral into those negative, more and more negative mental states. And anxiety is different from fear. It's a response to potential future threats rather than those in the here and now. And engages a physiological stress response through the sympathetic nervous system to enhance threat detection and preparation for dealing with that threat. Of course, we typically think of anxiety as being purely negative, but it can be adaptive in genuinely threatening situations, which aids in heightening our vigilance and readiness for defensive action. It can be a good thing. It is often a good thing. It should be a good thing. But of course, anxiety becomes maladaptive when it's triggered without reason, without good reason. And when it hinders normal living, when it hinders you from living a good life. And that spans a spectrum from helpful to harmful anxiety disorder patterns. There's not necessarily a sharp cutoff, although there are diagnoses that can be given by a mental health professional. But again, maladaptive anxiety leads to that avoidance of anxiety-inducing situations. It creates that cycle of avoidance and temporary relief that reinforces further avoidance. And then in exploring the neuroscience of anxiety, we talked about how the amygdala is kind of that threat detector almost, that influences the brain to engage this response. The insula and anterior cingulate are extremely important regions. The insula being responsible for our bodily feelings, the feelings associated with anxiety. Anterior cingulate having to do with that decision making, risk reward calculations, goal directed behavior, and also having a role in interoception and emotion. Alongside the network we talked about with the prefrontal cortex playing that goal and kind of instantiating, playing the role in instantiating the goal of searching for and preparing to deal with a threat or danger, as well as tamping down that stress response, tamping down the physiological response and the hypervigilance of the amygdala. And then the thalamus playing a role in filtering the perceptual information before it reaches the cortex to kind of selectively allow more threat-related rather than positive information to be enter kind of our conscious perception. You can think of it that way. And then the brainstem, of course, and hypothalamus being involved in triggering the actual physiological response of the stress response and defensive behaviors we might engage in. So then we talked about all of the physiological changes, the threat detection, the fight or flight response, and again, we talked about the difference between adaptive and maladaptive anxiety, and then the extreme sort of anxiety disorders that 30% of adults may experience such a disorder at some point in their life. We got that from the American Psychiatric Association. And then there's these different specific disorders that are associated with different patterns of neural activity, although that is a very young area of neuroscience. And we talked about some of these strategies for coping. There's the pharmacological interventions, but I think more importantly, the cognitive and behavioral and psychodynamic therapeutic approaches. Didn't go super deep into that, but again, we'll have a video more from a more kind of actionable angle on managing anxiety coming up. And they talked about some of the maybe future applications of neurotechnologies like transcranial magnetic stimulation and deep brain stimulation, being able to maybe normalize the activity of these circuits we've talked about. And so that is kind of where I'm going to end here. I really appreciate you watching this video. And this was initially available only to Patreon subscribers, Patreon patrons of Sense of Mind. And they also get access to blog post versions of every new video, including this one. So if you prefer reading, you can take that with you on your phone and read instead of just watching me yammer on about this stuff. And you'll get access to these live streams to be able to ask questions and watch live in real time. So thank you. A huge thank you to all the patrons, the people that have recently subscribed to the Patreon, and people who've been there for a while. You guys make this channel possible. You allow me to keep doing this and to keep trying to provide this information and share this with you. I really appreciate it. Sense of Mind just reached 10,000 subscribers, so that is awesome. Thank you all for watching and liking and subscribing. I can't say how grateful I am for all of this. So thanks so much for watching, and happy Halloween. Have a great one.